Hello, students. This is Mark Richman, and this is the eagerly anticipated lecture on memorization that I've been trying to get together for several days here. Welcome. I hope you all are feeling fine and safe and dealing with this pandemic in the best way we can, both mentally and physically. So, I first want to tell you of my discomfort in doing it in this format. I feel like I'm talking to a wall, which reminds me of a kind of a digression here of the pianists comparing Glenn Gould and Arthur Rubinstein and their views on performing. Glenn Gould preferred to perform in the studio. He didn't care much for people in general. He thought if he recorded in the studio, he could work to get technical perfection. He could mic it exactly the way he wanted to do it in the studio and have complete control over every note and therefore have the best performance possible. So he didn't perform a lot in his lifetime, and he really preferred recording in a quiet environment with no people but himself and the engineer. Whereas Arthur Rubinstein loved people. He much preferred performing for an audience. He did not like the sterility of recording over and over and trying to get it as perfect as possible. He thrived on the communication of the live audience. So it's like speaking. When you speak, you want to speak to somebody. So I'm in the Rubinstein camp. And by the way, I was lucky enough to hear Rubinstein play live many times. And you haven't really heard the real Arthur Rubinstein if you only hear his recordings, good as they are. When he just turned on to a live performance, and the playing was much more communicative, much freer, much warmer, because he just thrived on that communication with the audience, whereas Glenn Gould was just the opposite. So I'm in the Arthur Rubinstein camp. I feel I need an audience to talk to, so this feels very artificial to me. So I have some notes to the left of me that I probably otherwise wouldn't need as much if I was talking to you live. So please forgive me if this doesn't go as smoothly as I would have liked, because I've never done anything like this, and I didn't really rehearse this very much, except I know what I want to say, and hopefully it will come across in a clear and organized fashion. So here we go. Some preliminary thoughts about memory in general. You know, there's short-term memory and the long-term memory. Short-term memory turns out to be processed in two lobes of the brain called the frontal and parietal lobe, P-A-R-I-E-T-A-L, frontal and parietal lobe. Now, there is a little part of our brain called the hippocampus. The hippocampus means seahorse, literally, from the Greek. And the hippocampus, which looks like a seahorse, is a very, very small structure in the brain, essentially consolidates information from the short-term memory and transmits this information to other structures of the brain where it becomes long-term memory. Now, how does it do that? How does it process that? Repetition, repetition, repetition. So supposedly the hippocampus can't store any information, but it is the vehicle with which short-term memory becomes long-term memory. And long-term memory is what we want when we talk about memorization of music. And it cannot be done in one day. So this phenomenon, I think, explains why we might be practicing a new piece and you work on several passages. You get the fingering down and you are starting to learn it. And then when you return to this passage the very next day, it feels completely new to you. You cannot bring it back exactly the way you had it when you finished your practice before. That's because it has not become part of your long-term memory, and you have to kind of relearn it all over again in the short-term memory. But by this repetition process, the short-term memory finally starts to be processed into long-term memory, and that's when we start to learn. So I found that a very interesting process, and it explains a lot about the process we have to undergo when we have to memorize our music. Now, there is a question, how much of the brain do we really use? And it used to be thought that we only use 10% of our brain. So scientists say that's wrong. We use 100% of our brain every day because we are thinking, we're breathing, we're creating, we're using all the different structures and parts of the brain. But I think more to the point is how much can we access in terms of memory from all of our experiences. I would say it's closer to 3%, if that, 3% or less. Now, there have been some extraordinary cases of people with incredible memories. The actress Mary Lou Henner, who's as old as I am, claims to remember 100% of the events in her life. You can ask her, what did she have for lunch on May 31st, 1955, and she supposedly can tell you. So she has access to part of her brain that most of us, almost all of us, do not. This condition is called hyperthymesia. I'll spell that for you. Hyperthymesia. I don't know how that would translate into memorizing music. It could be a plus, it could be a minus, because I'm sure her mind is cluttered now with all kinds of useless thoughts. But she supposedly can remember every event that has ever happened in her entire life. Now, Arthur Rubinstein, in his autobiography, claimed that he was taking a train ride from one city to the next, and he looked at his program, and it was listed that he was going to be playing a Liszt Hungarian Rhapsody. I don't remember the number, but I think it was number 11. And that was a mistake because his program was supposed to read the Hungarian Rhapsody number 12, which he did play and did have memorized. So his story is, in his autobiography, that away from the keyboard, looking at the music, he opened his book and he learned the 11th Hungarian Rhapsody literally overnight on the train, and he not only committed it to memory, but it was in his fingers, so that the next night he performed the Hungarian Rhapsody number 11 for the very first time, I might add. I don't know about that. That sounds like a fishtail to me. I don't know how that's possible. So there are many things that people brag about that are not necessarily true. Walter Gieseking, the great pianist who was a Debussy expert and many other kinds of repertoire, he was said to have been able to memorize a piano concerto in a matter of hours. He had a certain system for that. These are extraordinary cases and stories, but for most of us, we have to do the hard work of committing the music we're working on to memory. And guess who we have to thank for that? None other than Clara Schumann, because music in the classic and Baroque and Renaissance periods, this keyboard music, was always performed with the score. It simply was always performed with the score. Clara Schumann was the first person to memorize and to perform in a memorized way. This caught on, fortunately or unfortunately. Franz Liszt was the next famous pianist to start performing in concert not only his pieces but other compositions from memory. I think that's because in the old days, there were commissioned works and composers and pianists got paid that way. But with the advent of more and more concerts, audiences were clamoring for the latest thing. And I suppose there was a wow factor in the spectacle of seeing a pianist perform from memory because it had never been done before. And Clara Schumann did that, and it absolutely caught on. Interestingly, Frédéric Chopin was very much against this new trend. He considered it vulgar, and he thought that only a composer should be playing from memory. And when some pianists tried to play a piece from memory by another composer, including himself, he would ask, "Are you the composer?" So it was considered a vulgar act. But it did catch on until modern day, you young students and concert pianists are expected to perform most works from memory on the concert stage. Unless it is a very contemporary work, then many pianists are using the score, and that's considered quote-unquote acceptable. I do want to mention that many famous pianists, and great pianists I might add, were known to use music in performance in modern times. William Masellos was a great American pianist who only performed with the score. Sviatoslav Richter is a name you should all know, probably the most famous Russian pianist of the 20th century. I would say after age about 50, he didn't trust his memory anymore, and 100% of the time, including pieces he had committed to memory and had been performing without the music, he started using music on the score for his concerts, and it people just expected that from him. That's what decision he decided to do. My teacher Leonard Shore, who was a very important concert pianist and teacher, only used the score. And even Yu Jia Wang, who we all are amazed by all the time when we hear her YouTubes or hear her in performance. I saw a recently televised performance of hers, and she was using the score in the form of an iPad, and it wasn't a particularly difficult work. Perhaps she hadn't had it a long time. I didn't judge that whatsoever. I just took note of that because she usually performs from memory, and she has an amazing memory and a very big repertoire, it appears. But she did perform from memory, so it is not forbidden. It's not forbidden, and I'll be posing an interesting question at the end of this short lecture about the use of score, what you think about that. And I know that for your recitals, you're required to play memorized, as I was when I was in my various degree programs in my various colleges. So, I want to mention that there are 4 kinds of memorization. This is very important. The aural, A-U-R-A-L, I don't mean oral, aural, visual, physical, intellectual. Aural, visual, physical, and intellectual. The aural has to do with the kind of memory. Have you ever had a piece that you used to play and you can kind of sing it, but you can't quite remember how to play it? That would be aural memory. The visual has to do with where is it on the page. That's an important kind of memory as well. As an example, when you were in high school or now that you're in college, have you ever studied for a test and then you have the test question and you're trying to remember the answer and you can remember even the chapter and the page where it was and where it was on the page, and you're imagining where it was to try to find the answer. You can't quite access it completely, or maybe you can, but you know where it was on the page. And that's part of your memory bank of accessing memory. So by visual, I don't mean the keyboard, because that we play mostly by feel. I mean basically where the notes are on the page and what they look like, how dense the rhythm looks, etc. So as an adjunct to this part of memory, I would recommend to you that you always use the same score. Do not change scores midway, because different scores have different layouts, as you know. And if you change midway, you're used to seeing a certain measure over here, and another score, it's now on the bottom over here, and it's very confusing to the brain to have 2 different visual memories. It's just going to make your work harder. Try to find the best edition you can and stick with it so that where the measures are remain where the measures are. They don't move around. Third kind of memory is the physical memory. This is what we mostly rely on. It's the muscle memory. There's a kinesthetic connection between the brain and the fingers. It's a learned response. So if there's a piece you haven't played in a long while, this is the opposite of aural memory. You may not be able to sing it, but your fingers can somehow find the notes. That's physical memory. Now, I must tell you that this kind of memory, which we all rely on, is very unreliable if this is the main source of your memory. I will be explaining that shortly. The fourth, and I think most important of all, is the intellectual memory. This has to do with form, identifying rhythmic, harmonic, and melodic structures of passages. So what I mean by that, a perfect example would be sonata allegro form. By now you all know that in the exposition, the second theme group of a major key piece would be expected to be in the dominant, and you indeed played in the dominant. In the recapitulation, the transition section is recomposed so that the second theme group and the closing theme group, and coda if there's any, is now transposed to be in the tonic. What happens if you rely only on your physical muscle memory? You can easily lapse from the exposition and jump to the recap, or from the recap back to the exposition, because the fingers remember both ways, and you can easily get fouled up by which way is it. There's a physical memory of both ways, and without understanding form, you may not have a clear idea where you are in the piece. If you were to understand, now I'm in the recapitulation, and you understand you have to stay in the key that you started in that will help you remember the starting notes of your second theme, and you won't have that kind of a slip. In fact, any change of parallel material should be marked in your score. Where the measures change in the recap, I'll often put an asterisk and I'll write change. So I will remember exactly where the notes change, which is a pathway to take me to the new key in the new transition section, so I won't lapse back to the other one. I have this very clear in my mind before I ever would perform. So intellectual memory is extremely important. But none of these four memories exist in isolation. They all should be working together. One helps the other for memory security. Now, the goal, in my opinion, should be not to just simply try to avoid memory slips, but learn how to best handle them if you get them, because that reduces the fear of having memory slips, which then would reduce the chances of even having a memory slip. So don't get caught up in the fear. So the goal should not be, if you're thinking, oh, I mustn't have a memory slip, sometimes negative thoughts like that become reality and you will have a memory slip. It's better to realize that it could happen, and it may happen in hopefully a small way, but you learn how to handle them by securing these four kinds of memory that I have laid out for you. So I have a bunch of suggestions for you, and I hope will help you. Some of them I think you've thought of already, some you may not have thought of. Number one, accept your imperfection. Memory slips will happen from time to time. All professional pianists have them. They just know how to cover them up extremely well. I can hear them if I hear a professional pianist perform a piece that I know well in my ear, but it's so momentary. It's not that I'm listening for the mistakes, but I do hear them, but the artist knows how to cover them up very well. And lest you think that great artists don't have memory slips or worry about memory slips, I will just quickly tell you that when I got to speak to Emmanuel Axe, whom most of you know who that is, a very, very more than competent concert pianist, plays all over the world and can play anything. I was asking him at the time about performance anxiety, which I was suffering with, which I hope to give a class in one day, because that's more than a lecture, that topic. And he said, oh, well, he said, if you think that I'm playing my program in Los Angeles for the first time, this isn't true. I prepare a couple of programs for the entire year, and I never play in a major city, such as Los Angeles, without at least trying out my program 10 to 15 times in very small venues in very small towns. If I make a mistake or have memory slips there, I'm not as concerned and I can fix them up. And by sheer repetition of doing this program over and over, by the time I get to Los Angeles, I'm quite secure, but you still never know what's going to happen. So everybody struggles with this, and it's good to know join the crowd. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with you if you worry about memory slips. Need not worry about them because they're going to happen, and I'm trying to help you how to get past the fear and how to handle these and how to prepare for performance as good as you can. But there's no magic bullet here about avoiding memory slips. Forget what you hear on the internet. I heard all kinds of things, and I decided to give you my own thoughts rather than do research with what people are saying. People are saying all kinds of foolproof methods to avoid memory slips. I don't take it from them unless I hear them play the Tchaikovsky Concerto, all 90 pages from memory. Probably they can't do that. There's no surefire method because every pianist I've talked to struggles with it. They just don't talk about it. I'm talking about it. Okay, so number two is try not to memorize. This is now a point that there's some disagreement, but I feel strongly that you should not try to memorize a piece as you work on the piece. Because if you try memorizing the piece at the very beginning of your learning of the music, you're memorizing on a notes level. You're also memorizing mistakes of notes, rhythm, and phrasing, etc., with no concepts to back it all up. So that means that when you start having lessons on it and studying more deeply, you will now have to unlearn the mistakes and rememorize. To me, memorization should be ideally a natural process of studying the music, but do not try to memorize the music first while you're learning it. It's going to be a process after you are learning the music and while you're learning the music. Now, in a performance, this is number 3, never jump back. I've heard people do that, and you've probably heard people do that. If you do that, it could happen again. And I've heard many student recitals. I haven't quite heard this in any live performances. I've certainly heard breakdowns of performance due to memory. But I've heard a student start over 4 or 5 times and keep breaking down. And it's so uncomfortable to hear that. And you can imagine what the pianist is going through. What you want to do is find structural signposts to jump forward if necessary, so that you can pick up a little bit ahead, and you won't have the problem of having to go through that section again. Number 4, you want to study the music from every conceivable angle, everything, especially melodic phrasing and patterns and harmonic progressions, because you're building a connection with the music before the process of memorization is even taking place that way. So that's important that you think of the harmonies and everything, all of the analysis should be done at the same time learning the music, because that will definitely help secure the memory as opposed to learning from just a notes level, which is what you're basically doing the very first time. Number 5, it's important to always practice hands separate, especially the left hand alone. The reason is that it trains the ear to listen better, and we cannot separate the ear from memorization. I would say that 90% of memory slips occur in the left-hand simple accompaniments, and they occur in slow movements in particular. I think because there hasn't been a lot of practicing over and over to instill the muscle memory as much as in faster passages. But it's also because the ear tends to listen to the right hand. Even if you have a homophonic texture where the melody is in the left hand, like the Merry Farmer by Schumann, that little piece, and the accompaniments in the right hand, the ear picks up the right hand. The ear just tends to hear the higher frequencies. So if the ear is not carefully listening to the left hand, that's where the memory slips are going to crop up. If you practice very often, left hand alone, your ear will be listening to the left hand, and your short-term memory will be processing that, and the hippocampus will eventually transmit this information to the rest of your brain so that you will better learn your piece in a more long-term secure way. So be sure that you practice the left hand alone and actively listen to what's going on in that left hand, because it's very undervalued. If the technique is easy in the left hand, one tends not to practice it very much. But you really need to train the ear to listen to the left hand tremendously. This will help secure the memory. Number 6, you don't want to learn first the notes and the rhythm only, because you'll have to go back and learn everything else. So right away, I want you to learn and feel all the dynamics and expression marks and add phrasing and musicality to your study. Again, you're in the process of building a connection to the music. If you learn to play everything with expressive intent and musical involvement, the technique, by the way, is always easier, and the memory process is always easier, more profound, and more secure. Number 7, try studying your score away from the piano, especially if you don't currently have a piano to use or you don't have a piano in front of you. Many of you are relying on practicing at school, even before this pandemic happened. But you can take the score when you're home, not with the instrument, and look at the score carefully. This, by the way, this silent method of study was the so-called Gieseking method, Walter Gieseking, that I mentioned earlier, method of memorization. You study it silently. Look at all the markings. Try to hear the music in your head. Silently move your fingers and your forearms and your wrists, and try to feel the way the music feels physically that way. Study the form and the harmonies. In this way, you're using all 4 types of memory at once. You're using the oral because I want you to hear it in your imagination. You're using the visual. You're certainly studying the page. You're using the physical because you are feeling what it feels like to play the notes. And the intellectual, that's a very good time to be studying the form of the music and the harmonic structure, because you're not distracted by the technique, are you? Because you're not practicing technique. So this is a very good way to secure the memory, because you're using all four types of memory when you do it, this silent kind of practice. And as I say, this was Giesecke's way of learning a piece completely. I don't think that's all that we do, but this was his method that he taught his students how to memorize. Number 8, give yourself enough time to digest the score. No cramming. Remember that I said the hippocampus, it's a process going from short-term memory to long-term memory. What is required are the 3 R's of memorization. Repetition, repetition, repetition. You can't expect to learn in a profound way a piece and have it memorized if you've only been working on it a very short time. You have to give yourself enough time to digest the score. And there's a physical reason for this, which I explained in the brain processes earlier. Number 9, towards the end of the memorization process, seek out opportunities to perform under pressure. Now, when we were all meeting live at school, studio class is a perfect vehicle for this, because certain things will crop up both technically and memory-wise that you didn't expect, and it tells you what needs to be secure, doesn't it? You don't need studio class. Playing for other people is the same kind of situation. Even recording yourself playing without stopping would be a good way to practice playing under pressure. When we're practicing, it's a different state of mind. We know we can go over things a million times. Not a million times, but you know what I mean. But when you have to play without stopping, the mindset is in a different place. There's a nervousness that will set in, which you can deal with, but it's a different experience, isn't it? So I think a practice performance, no matter how informal, is worth several weeks of practicing, because you'll discover places that are insecure that way, and the more you do that, the more secure you'll get. Because of that, when I try to do that, and I find something I thought I knew, but something funny happened, you can be sure after that experience I will study the score in every aspect. What was it that disturbed me? Was it a voicing of some kind? Did I end up in the wrong key, and why? I'll write this in my score, the key I'm supposed to be in. And I will tell you that if you really study the mistakes that you made afterwards, not during performance, go on, but if you study the mistakes that you make in a practice performance, it will not happen again. It will not happen again. It may happen in another place, but it won't happen again. And that's what Emanuel Ax meant when he said he performed, not practiced, performed 10 to 15 times in these other venues. By the time he came to Los Angeles, his program was secure as far as the memory is concerned. Now, there is another way to practice that I would recommend for slow movements. It's very doable. And for passages where the memorization is still not secure, when you've done everything you think you should be doing, including many of my suggestions. So it's called a subsection technique. That's what I call it. So what you do is you take a subsection, starting from the beginning of your movement. You practice the left hand alone with the score in front of you for maybe 16 measures or so. Close the book. Play those 16 measures from memory. Now, you can only do this after you've studied the piece. This is not something you do the first week. This is something when you're going to be performing it, but you feel it's not as secure as it could be. So you take that 16 measures, for instance, book open, left hand alone, book closed, left hand alone. Book open, right hand alone. Book closed, right hand alone. If you make a mistake, open the book. What did you do? Close the book again, right hand alone. Once you got that cooking, you got it right, then you open the book, play those 16 bars hands together, looking at the score. Then take the score away, play hands together. It will probably be completely accurate. Then you go on to the next 8 or 16 bars. You do the same process. Then you add it to the first section. Now this process, as you can imagine, can take a day, depending upon, or days of practice, depending on how many pages you're needing to secure. It could take a few days, it could take a week or more. But it is a way to really solidify the final steps of what you're playing. I don't think it's practical to do a 90-piece concerto this way, because it will take you maybe 3 years of practice. You'll find that in the faster movements, you won't need to do this kind of practicing. Once you get the technique down and all of this repetition, it will start to form your long-term memory. But I find with slow movements, there'll be a voicing that I won't quite get. I can hear the chord, but the voicing isn't quite right. So in that case, the physical memory is just not strong enough. Even though intellectually I know what it's supposed to be, but I don't know, is it a diminished chord BDF? Is it an FBD inversion? So if I practice this, particularly paying attention to the left hand, with this building block technique of repeating it from the beginning of the section to the end, and build the movement that way, it's like totally secure. There was a person on YouTube, I'm not going to mention his name, he has a lot of videos, some of which are good, most of which I don't find very helpful, where he talks about memorizing backwards. Have some of you heard about this? I don't recommend that at all. I think it's more confusing than anything else. What he meant by that was he takes the final phrase, memorize that, then you go to the penultimate, the second to last phrase, and then go forward to the end, and then you end up at the beginning. The problem is, I'll give you an example. I just recently memorized Mozart Rondo K511, which is in my repertoire, which I was going to play in my recital this spring before it got canceled because of the pandemic. So every time that theme comes in, it's a very difficult piece to memorize. There are not a lot of notes, but it's a 10-minute work. And as a rondo is, there's a reiteration of the A theme over and over. So every time that A theme comes in, there's a slight variant. A little chromatic scale for 5 notes, a different left hand, almost the same, different rhythm, slight differences. And I have to remember the order. It must happen 6 or 7 times. If I were to rehearse it backwards, from the end to the beginning, I would totally screw up the order of the theme where the variants come in. You could even call it variant 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It happens like 7 times. So I've had to study that very carefully from the beginning to the end and try to remember those variants in order. So I think the suggestion of recording backwards is usually counterproductive. So I want to end this short lecture by posing a question to you. And the question is, does playing without the score facilitate a freer and deeper performance? I think there are 2 points of view. The people who would say yes would say that playing without the score frees you from depending on seeing the notes, so you can give a much freer performance instead of having your eyes glued to the score or looking at the score too much. So that's one point of view. The other point of view, the answer would be no, because when there's no score in front of you to refer to in case of a memory lapse, this induces fear, which greatly inhibits freedom of performance, greatly inhibits it. So there are 2 points of view. Either you think that it's good if you can memorize the whole piece because it frees you from the score, or no, because how can you be free when you're worrying about whether you're going to have a memory lapse or not? So I leave that to you as an open question. I myself are in camp number 2. I would prefer to have the score if I could, but many people feel that it frees you for greater expression. I'll leave that up to you to ponder, and it's been a pleasure talking to you, I think. As again, I can only imagine that you're listening to this, otherwise it again feels very strange. And I wish you all the luck in the world, all the best wishes, and I will now download this, and hopefully today is Tuesday. You will have this in your email boxes by this evening after I download it, which will take quite some time. This has been a 34-minute lecture. I hope it's been helpful, and thank you for your attention. And I loved having you in class. I miss all of you, and I look forward to the day that we can see each other in person again. Bye for now.